Good evening. I'm Mark Updegrove, the director of the LBJ Library, and on behalf of my friend Don Carlton, the executive director of the Briscoe Center, I want to welcome you here tonight. Tonight we continue our dialogue around the legendary newsman Walter Cronkite, and we do so in conjunction with our exhibit, Cronkite, Eyewitness to a Century. If you haven't seen this exhibit, I urge you to do so. In fact, the traffic here at the LBJ Library has spiked by 30% since we've had it in-house. So please do so if you haven't already. Walter Cronkite set the standard for journalistic integrity during his tenure at CBS. And tonight we are delighted to have Morley Safer and Lesley Stahl as our guests. As anyone who has watched the seconds tick away on 60 Minutes knows, they uphold the tradition that was set by Walter Cronkite. Before we get started, though, I want to introduce a couple of folks in our audience, and I would ask that you refrain from applauding until I've introduced all of them. The first is Linda Robb, the daughter of President and Mrs. Johnson. Catherine, we can applaud for Linda. Yeah, that's... Catherine Robb, the granddaughter of President Johnson and Mrs. Johnson. Kathy Cronkite, daughter of Walter Cronkite. Kathy. Glenn Frankel, the Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter and the new director of the UT's School of Journalism. Denise Trouth, the president of Texas State University. And finally, Ray Benson, who's in the band Asleep at the Wheel. And Ray, you've got nothing to do with any of this, but we just think you're cool. Before I bring out my friend Don Carlton, I want to remind you that you can submit questions for our guests this evening by filling out those cards that were given to you upon entrance into the auditorium and passing them on to the aisle, and I'll be asking them of our guests later on this evening. For those of you who have seen our exhibit on Walter Cronkite, you know it's a phenomenal piece of work, and really it's due to my friend Don Carlton. He was the creative energy and spirit behind it, and it came out of his deep friendship with Walter Cronkite. That same friendship resulted in Don's latest book, Conversations with Cronkite, which I can tell you is phenomenal in and of itself. I read it in one sitting, and it really brings out the true voice of Walter Cronkite. If you haven't got that, we'd be happy to sell you a copy. Just go up to the LBJ Museum. So there's a little self-interest here, but honestly, it's a great read. And without any further ado, I want to introduce my very dear friend, Don Carlton, who will get our program started. Don?
Well, good evening. My goodness, we have a few folks here. This is just great. Before we bring our distinguished guests out, I want to thank the folks who made the exhibit possible, and that's our good friends at the University Federal Credit Union, the CBS affiliate in Austin, KITV, the McCombs Foundation, members of the Briscoe Center's Advisory Council, and the Office of the President and the Office of the Provost here at the university. We very much appreciate that support. Walter Cronkite was anchor of the CBS Evening News from 1962 until March of 1981. His news program dominated the ratings the last 12 years of his tenure as anchor, and Walter became a trusted father figure to a generation of viewers, earning him the title Most Trusted Man in America. For our program tonight, we have invited two celebrated journalists who were CBS News correspondents during different decades of Walter's years as anchor. We're going to ask them to discuss those years when Walter Cronkite's voice was the most authoritative news voice in America. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce those guests. First is my good friend, Morley Safer. A native of Toronto, Canada, Morley joined CBS News in 1964 after working for newspapers and wire services and Canada and Great Britain. In 1965, he opened the CBS News Saigon Bureau and served 2 tours reporting on the Vietnam War. From 1967 until late 1970, Morley served as the CBS News London Bureau Chief, covering Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. Since December 1970, he's been a correspondent for 60 Minutes. This current season marks his 41st season on that program. Morley is also the author of the best-selling memoir, Flashbacks on Returning to Vietnam, which was published by Random House in 1990. And as many of you know, Morley Safer has chosen the Dolph Briscoe Center as the permanent home for his historical papers. The National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences has recognized Morley Safer with a Lifetime Achievement Emmy, and he has earned numerous other Emmys, 3 Overseas Press Club Awards, 4 George Foster Peabody Awards, 2 Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University Awards, and 2 George Polk Memorial Awards, among many others. Lesley Stahl has been a correspondent for 60 Minutes since March 1991. A native of Massachusetts and a cum laude graduate of Wheaton College in Illinois, Lesley Stahl was working as an on-the-air reporter on a local television station in Boston in 1972 when she drew the attention of CBS News. She was soon hired as a correspondent for the network's famed Washington Bureau. Throughout the 1970s and until Walter retired in 1981, Lesley Stahl's reports appeared frequently on Cronkite's evening news program. She also had important reporting assignments at political conventions and on election night coverage anchored by Walter Cronkite. Lesley Stahl was CBS News White House correspondent during the Carter and Reagan presidencies and part of the term of George H.W. Bush. From 1983 until 1991, she also served as moderator of CBS's program, Face the Nation. Her experience covering Washington for more than 20 years was the subject of her book, Reporting Live, which was published in 1999. The stories she covered prior to her joining 60 Minutes ranged from Watergate through the 1981 assassination attempt on President Reagan to the 1991 Gulf War. Lesley Stahl has received a number of Emmy Awards for her interviews on Face the Nation and for her 60 Minutes reporting, including an Emmy for Lifetime Achievement given in September 2003. Her many other awards include an Alfred DuPont Columbia University Journalism Award, the Fred Friendly First Amendment Award, and an Edward R. Murrow Award for overall excellence in television. Please join me in welcoming Lesley Stahl and Morley Safer. Well, let me begin this discussion, first of all, by thanking Lesley Stahl and Morley Safer for coming to Austin and being with us here tonight. They made the trek from New York, and we're very pleased to have them. And before we talk about Walter Cronkite and I guess what they call the golden age of journalism, we'll discuss that more in a minute. I think the audience would enjoy knowing how and why you became journalists and how you joined the CBS News team. Let's start with you, Lesley.
Okay. Well, it never entered my mind when I was in school to be a journalist. I never studied it. I didn't write for the school paper. But I was interested in politics, and I was working for the mayor of New York, and And I wandered into the press room and said to one of the reporters, "What do you do all day? What do you actually do?" And when he finished telling me, I literally had a burning desire to become a reporter. And my first job, I was just telling you, in journalism, was with NBC. And worked on the Huntley-Brinkley Report. And every day, I was right. Every day has been exciting. I didn't like to get up from my early jobs before journalism. I wanted to get up and go to work every day since. So there it is.
Morley, how did you get in journalism?
Well, I knew what I wanted to do from about age 15 or 16.
15 or 16.
Part of it was that I'd spent the years, I was going to say the early years, but the years by the time I reached the age of reason, which I would guess would be about 10, following World War II, which was just all-consuming, and following it in the newspapers. And then at 15 or 16, I started to read Hemingway, and I said, that's it. That's what I want to be. Hemingway had covered the Spanish Civil War for the Toronto Star, which was then the biggest paper in the country. And I knew that I wanted to be a reporter, and I wanted to be a foreign correspondent. And I'm so lucky that, a childhood dream actually came true.
Well, Lesley, I said something in the introduction about you being on the air in Boston and you in CBS. Sorry. How did that happen though? Did they just call you? I mean, how did you get into the CBS team?
Well, I was working for NBC. They sent me to London, where I met Morley, who was at that point the CBS bureau chief. And I was quite bored, I will say. 1969 was not a great year to be a reporter in London, unless you were covering Northern Ireland.
Well, Northern Ireland was the sort of Vietnam of the moment.
Yeah, so it was a great story if they sent you up there. They did not send me up there. So I came back home. I grew up in Boston, and I went to work for the local CBS station there. And Sandy Sokolow, who's in the audience in the front row, called me up one day, and affirmative action had passed, or was becoming important in the industry. And it was very popular in the early 70s, affirmative action. And Sandy Sokolow called me up and he said, "They're desperate for women. Send them a tape. Send CBS a tape." So I put together this tape that ran how many hours? 4 hours? And he called me up and he said, "Are you out of your mind? Send them 20 seconds. So I redid my tape and sent them 20 seconds. And there was one story I had done in Boston that was very silly. And the bureau chief in Washington, who both, did you ever work for Bill Small? No.
Thank goodness, no.
He was very good to me. He hired me. He liked the silly piece. And for the whole time I worked for him, which was about 10 years, maybe more, 20 years, he kept saying, "How come you never do any silly pieces?" That was the piece I loved. But he hired me because that's why. That's how I got to CBS. And I arrived, I mean, you talk about timing. I've never had good timing. This was the only moment in my whole life. But I arrived in Washington, and there was this break-in the minute I got there at this Watergate complex. And nobody thought that was anything at all. It was a local break-in and entering. But because it happened at the Democratic Party, they said, "Well, we'll send the new girl. You know, she can mess up, the new young kid." So they sent me. And I remember they sent me for 3 or 4 days in a row. And I met this guy in the courtroom of the arraignment of the burglars themselves. And we became very good friends. It was Bob Woodward. And he kept saying to me, "Whatever you do, don't get off this story. Just cling to this story." So that was my
Well,
break.
that's a good
It was a
break
good
in.
break.
That's a good break in, isn't it? Morley, how did you get hooked up with CBS?
Actually, it wasn't my fault. I was the London correspondent for CBC, and in 1963, I guess it was, they brought all the correspondents back to Toronto to do those kind of dog and pony shows that we all used to do, year-end reviews reflecting back on the previous year. And we had a correspondent who covered the UN. His name was Stanley Burke, who was a real matinee idol of a guy, and very handsome, very good reporter. Stanley, on the quiet, was trying to get a job at CBS News. So he sent them a tape, and he sent them the tape of this year-end show, and they called me. So it was, again, I mean, I fell into it. I was perfectly happy doing what I was doing. But when CBS called, and I was just blown over by it, to the idea of working with guys like Moreau, who was still there, and Winston Burdett and Charles Collingwood, and these really the legends of American journalism, not just broadcast journalism.
Well, I was going to ask you about that, because when you came into CBS in the early 60s, there was still this overlap between Murrow's boys. Some of them were very much present. Of course, Murrow's boys, for our students in the audience, those correspondents who were recruited to CBS by Edward R. Murrow to cover World War II, and they were collectively known as Murrow's boys. But they were still there at CBS. Some of them were still at CBS, but yet some of the Cronkite, the new guard, was there too. So there was this overlap.
Most of the Murrow's boys were still working at CBS then.
Well, what kind of impact did that have on CBS to have those two generations overlap? Were they mentors? Or?
It was kind of interesting. Walter had certainly a very professional relationship with all those guys, but there was always the slight suspicion that they looked down on this mere wire service guy. And a lot of those guys, Winston Burdett, for example, and Collingwood, when you covered foreign news, the guy from CBS and the guy from the New York Times were the two people the tyrant of the moment would actually talk to. So it was almost a diplomatic mission in a certain way. And I think some of those guys, many of them had pretty fancy college degrees, kind of looked down slightly on Walter, and Walter felt that. And there was a resentment, there's no question. But it never affected the coverage. But it was an interesting confrontation in a way. Walter, very much a man of the people, which he truly was, and a bunch of other guys who were, I guess, slightly effete, or at least acted as if they were.
Well, now, Lesley, when you...
Along those lines, I'll tell a story.
Yeah,
I always
please,
heard,
please.
Who knows if it's true? You don't care, right? The story was that Charles Collingwood, and he was one of Morrow's boys, right?
And my mentor at CBS.
And your mentor. Well, here's a story. You tell me if it's true. We'll check it out right now. We'll get a second source. That he had been in London, right? London or Paris?
He had been during the war?
Well, where was he? Where was his?
He was in both London and
London and Paris. So he had really come to understand fine wine. And they moved him back to Washington right before I was hired, so it must have been the very late 60s. And he goes to the best French restaurant, and I'm looking at Sandy to see if the story is true, best French restaurant in Washington. And he always sent back the wine, whatever they served, their best bottle, whatever. So the sommelier pulls out his absolute best bottle now, because Collingwood's coming for again. And the wine is so superb that he doesn't know what to do. He tastes it, he smells it, and then he says, "Send back the bread."
Good story.
That's what he means by a feat.
Great story. Great story. Well, Lesley, when you joined CBS News in the early 70s, at that time women were just beginning to come into the news teams on television. And what was it like as a woman to enter the men's world of CBS Evening News?
Well, as I said, most of us, not all of us, but most of us were hired under affirmative action starting in 72. And we were apprentices. They hired us and assigned us to senior correspondents. And it's actually a wonderful system because we didn't get to make our mistakes, the early mistakes that all young journalists and all young people do in whatever profession, in front of the larger audience. And we got a chance to ease our way in and prove that we could write radio and that we could cover a story well and write it under deadline. So it was a time when I think the women and the minorities who were hired didn't resent that in those days. We were just so thrilled to be in the door. And this would probably be in law firms and in medical schools. I mean, all the different doors that affirmative action opened for us. I know that there was sexism. I wrote my book. I didn't really feel it at all. I felt that my bosses hired me and wanted me to succeed. I felt that my colleagues, I had a little trouble with the cameramen, but I felt that my colleagues were pulling for us. And it was just exceptional to be, particularly at CBS, in the Washington Bureau. Because by 1970, it wasn't Morrow's boys anymore. They were Walter's horsemen. And they were the cream of broadcast television news, and they were also the cream of journalism, even. As you say, the New York Times and CBS News, even through the 70s, were thought of as the top of the profession. So it was just wonderful to be in the door.
Well, you said something about that you weren't allowed to make mistakes. In reading your book, I noticed that you mentioned something about that you committed a terrible sin of smiling while doing a stand-up.
Well, there was a lot of concern that the audience would not accept women as authoritative because we had never been in that position to tell the public what went on today. Would they accept us? So we all had to lower our voices. I remember very deliberately wearing glasses, which I do need, but I could have taken them off of the camera. And my mother was always fighting me on this. She kept saying, no one's ever going to ask you on a date if you wear your glasses. That's my mother. But we were always trying to present ourselves as people of gravitas, people who had authoritative sounding voices, looked serious. And I remember I told a funny story and I smiled. And the producer was just livid at me because it was late and on deadline. I had to go out and do it again. It was funny, but I wasn't allowed to smile because I was a woman and it would take away from my image of authority.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit now about Walter Cronkite specifically. When did, both of you take this question, when did you first meet Walter? What were your initial impressions? In other words, how was he?
The first time I actually met him was I was brought back from Vietnam for a couple of weeks of R&R in, I guess it must have been 1965. And Walter invited me to dinner at the house. And he'd contacted me before, sent me cables and that kind of thing in Vietnam. So I already had an impression of him, and the impression I had was that you really, out there at the end of the line, you really had a guy watching your back here, and Cronkite was that. And he threw this very nice dinner, and it was great fun, as being with Walter, as you know. always was. And, you know, in a certain way, you talk about affirmative action, I felt that I had somehow passed the test based on that first evening.
At that dinner party?
At that dinner, that I was one of the guys. I was just this alien from Canada before that. And somehow, and what was interesting, there was no business discussed at all. It wasn't being grilled by him or by other guests, but it was all just good fun. And I guess, and that's when I got to know him, and we had turned out some mutual friends from his World War II days. And in those next couple of weeks that I was back there, he, you know, invited me to the theater with Betsy, and we saw a lot of each other, and it was, he was a wonderful friend. And as a correspondent working 13,000 miles away, you really felt secure that he was somehow watching your back home.
I see. Lesley, when did you meet him?
Well, I met Walter twice. The first time was when I was working in Boston, so it must have been 71, I'm thinking. Sandy Sokolow will be able to tell us what year it was. Walter got the first interview with Daniel Ellsberg of the famous Pentagon Papers. And Walter had secreted himself into Cambridge, Massachusetts. And he had to come to the local CBS affiliate to get the tape. The film, we used to have the film developed on these big machines, and the film was developed and edited at WHDH-TV in Boston. And the word went all through the newsroom that Walter Cronkite was here, and he'd gotten Daniel Ellsberg. Well, of course, we should have gotten Daniel Ellsberg. We were the local reporters, but we didn't. But it was as if a rock star had come into the building. I mean, the energy level was up, and I remember running around just trying to get a look at him. And I did meet him. He said hello. He was very serious, and he was going about his business. It was a big story. And I think he was racing off to fly back home and leaving the film and his editors there. It was Stanhope Gould, Sandy, was left in the bureau to cut the tape. So my first sighting of Walter was very much with him up on a pedestal. And then I was hired by CBS. I didn't meet him. And I hadn't been there very long, 2 years, when I was asked, because they wanted to show the country that they had some women to anchor on election night in '74. And that's when he invited me to dinner. And my story about having my first dinner with Walter Cronkite and my first really getting to meet him personally was such a head spinner. I walked out kind of almost as if I was punch drunk in a funny way. He was Walter Cronkite still to me. He was the guy on television, very serious, very courageous, always took on the most difficult issues. If Walter really felt it was important, as with Vietnam, he went on the air. He was somebody I so admired, and I was so proud to work for him. And I get to his house, and he told the most vile jokes I've ever heard in my whole life. And I know that he did this. And there's a famous picture in the exhibit that Don just showed me, and it's with President Reagan and Vice President Bush at the time, and they're just dying laughing, and Walter had told some vile joke. So the vile joke that I heard had to be the least vile joke that he could possibly tell, because I was there, a woman was there. I couldn't tell you. I'll just give you a hint. It was a proctology joke. He was so hilarious that night. He did imitations. He was a fantastic rock hunter. He could imitate anybody.
Did he do his famous striptease?
He did. He did his famous striptease. There were other people there. And I, like you, thought...
He did his striptease, by the way, without taking all of his clothes off.
No, he did. I mean, it was fantastic. And I had gone in, I actually studied for dinner. I thought it was going to be about what was going on in the news. Walter Cronkite, Uncle Walter, you'd expect this. It was priceless, and I already worshipped him. Well, you can imagine how much I loved him after that. If you're a woman and you would really just wanted to be one of the guys, and he's telling me dirty jokes, wow. Totally.
Well, you know, I think we should mention both of you are talking about going to have dinner at the Cronkite house, and of course, Kate.
Oh, Betsy. We should tell about Betsy.
That's exactly where I was going.
Let me add one other thing. So here's Walter. He's the center of it. In fact, we sat in a room. I'm sorry, Kathleen isn't here, but he sat in the den upstairs, and they had this ottoman, and there were other people there, and he was performing in the round. He would go around, and Betsy kept putting him down, saying, "Come on, Walter, let someone else talk. Come on, Walter."
I think that was part of the act, actually.
they worked it out ahead of time. It's so fun.
Well, you both, Morley, you were a correspondent before you went to 60 Minutes during the 60s, that period. Lesley, you were in the 70s. What I'd like to ask you about, Morley, as you were filing reports back to New York, different places that you were in, what do you consider to be the most notable, really important story that you did during that time that was broadcast on Cronkite's Evening News?
Well, the Vietnam coverage, obviously, Walter was very engaged in that story. In terms of a single story, there was the burning of a series of hamlets called Cam Ne that the Marines had gone in a search and destroy mission. And it literally was a search and destroy. And I was on that operation and reported it as I saw it. And the shit really hit the fan.
You might just take a second and just tell us what happened in that story that was so inflammatory, at least from other points of view.
Well, we showed there was more happening that we could show on television, but essentially the Marines went in with flamethrowers and Zippo lighters and matches and set fires to the entire hamlets, ordering people to line up and get out and just literally leveling these communities. And in one case, they were about to put a flamethrower on a house, and the cameraman I was working with, a man named Hatukan, a wonderful cameraman, a Vietnamese, heard a baby cry. And he did the most courageous thing. He just ran towards that hut. The guys didn't let go with the flamethrower. And 4 people came out, including 3 little children. So this was a story that did not amuse the U.S. Marine Corps or the White House or many others. I was accused of having set the thing up, that I had given the guys the lighters to light the houses up, that it was a Marine operation. It was a Marine, training operation in an abandoned village. Every conceivable thing, but
it was a training.
And of course, the more they denied this, the bigger the whatever you want to call it incident became. Mm-hmm. So that story had resonated a lot. It also came at a time when the country was becoming apart over Vietnam as well. So it had a searing effect. I mean, happened to be the reporter on the story. I didn't. I claim no great credit for discovering it. I didn't know what kind of operation was going on when I went. It became apparent very quickly what kind of operation it was.
But as you say, the shit hit the fan, to quote you. And so, how did Cronkite handle that situation?
Cronkite stood up for his guys. I mean, he was absolutely foursquare. There followed a ridiculous comedy of errors of an investigation of me. Somebody went up to Canada and asked my sister if I read communist books. I mean, weird, really weird stuff. There was a guy at the Pentagon who claimed that he knew that I had given the young Marine a Zippo lighter and told him which house to burn down. I mean, this kind of bizarre stuff. And being in the Johnson Library, I should say that the president was not amused, and he called Frank Stanton, who was then president of CBS, very early one morning, and said, Frank? And Frank Stanton said, who is this? He said, it's your president. Stanton knew the president because he'd worked on one of the presidential commissions, I believe. And he said, well, what can I do for you, Mr. President? I'll spare you the next line. But he then said, Frank, you know what you folks did last night? You shat on the American flag. So there was a lot of anger. And apparently when the president, I forgot who he was in conversation with, it might have been Moyers, I'm not 100% sure. He said, well, what do you expect? He's a communist. And somebody said, no, he's a Canadian. He said, well, it's the same damn thing.
That's great. But Walter covered your back, as you said. I mean,
always, absolutely stood up. Look, you had to be right. I mean, he wasn't covered for you if you screwed up, believe me.
Yeah.
And you can ask Sandy about that. He knows, you know, when people didn't perform the way he thought they should perform, he let them know. But otherwise, he was foursquare.
Well,
Lesley, what about a notable story, something that you think?
Well, of course, Watergate.
Yeah.
But you know, while Morley was talking, and this applies to Watergate, the great joy of working for CBS when Walter was the anchor man was that we really did what I always thought journalists are supposed to do, and that is hold our governments, who's ever in power, hold their feet to the fire. We're the cleansing agent. And when we're doing our job right, that's what we do. Walter was courageous. And he was courageous during Vietnam. I always thought, Morley, that your piece led directly to Walter making his statement about Vietnam.
No, I think, I don't think so. That we can talk about this
Okay, but during
later.
Watergate, obviously, Walter had very long pieces on Watergate that he organized himself, he directed, and he was determined to get on the air. The first Watergate story that Walter did was 14 minutes long, which was basically his entire show. And just by giving it that much time, he was telling the American public, look, something is rotten in Denmark, and pay attention to this. When he tried to do a second 14-minute piece, He then was forced by people above him, people in the corporation, Mr. Paley and so forth, Frank Stanton and so forth, to cut the piece in half, but he still did a 7-minute piece. So Walter could lead the news division in a way that we thought was the proper and the right role for the fourth estate, which is to be that fourth leg of the stool that makes sure they're not corrupt and they're not abusing power and they're not breaking the rules that we're all supposed to live by. And it was a pleasure to follow him, to work under that.
Well, I want to ask something. I don't think you did that much live coverage with Walter Morley, did you? But you did some live stuff.
I did only a couple of things. Well, one was the moon landing. I was up in Jodrell Bank in England, where there's enormous radio telescope for us, and I found that Walter had this reputation as being an air hog.
Well, I was going to ask you about that.
But not in my limited experience, it wasn't. And I'll tell you, he would not try and be an air hog on a story that you knew more than he knew. I mean, he did not. If he felt he had something to say, he didn't hold back.
Well, go ahead.
But at that night, what had happened, I don't know if you remember, the Russians launched a satellite going for the moon. It was just trying to take so it caused a bit of a fuss for an hour or two, what exactly they were up to. And I was the guy at Jodrell Bank tracking this thing. And that was the point at which I wish Walter had been more of an air hog.
So he cut to you, and you weren't ready.
I was not ready.
Well, let me read you a quote. I asked him about that, and I want you to read, because you did more live coverage with him. But let me read a quote.
Okay.
I asked him about that. I said, you've been accused of being an air hog, Walter, and he said, I'm aware that I had that reputation of being a microphone hog. I wouldn't go to the correspondence instantly because as anchor I was creating a running story and trying to fit things into their proper place. I know that was annoying to the correspondent standing there with somebody he wanted to put on the air. They wanted airtime themselves and they thought they had a good story, but I can tell you a lot of times they didn't. But they thought they did, and that's all right.
Well,
Comment.
It sounds to me like he's really talking about the conventions when
Right,
we would be on for many hours. Yeah. And my favorite, this is my favorite story, but also involves Walter to a great extent. Oh my gosh, what year was it? Was Reagan's
80,
first
76,
80.
76 or 80.
Reagan's first, so 80. Yeah. So Reagan, it's his convention, the first time he's going to run. And who is going to be his vice president?
80.
Well, everybody decides it's going to be Jerry Ford, and it's going to be almost like a co-presidency, Reagan and Ford. And Walter has this story. It's Walter's story, and he is pushing this all night long. And when conventions start, we go on the air at basically 6:30, and we stay on till whatever happens. And this was going to be the third night. Who's he going to pick for vice president? And Reagan really hadn't picked anybody yet, which is, imagine today, everything is so orchestrated. He really hadn't. So Walter's going with Jerry Ford. And a guy comes running over to me, and he says, it's going to be George Bush. So I realize I have to tell Walter that he's been wrong for the past 4 hours, in which he did hog the air with his Bush story. And he had Bush's person, and then, not Bush, with Jerry Ford's person, and this Ford person, and that Ford person. And so he comes down to me, and I said, Walter, It's going to be George Bush. He said, wait a minute. What? It's going to be George Bush. I'm hearing it from everybody. They're pouring out of the Reagan trailer. Now I'm surrounded. I've looked at this tape. I'm very excited because I'm the story. And you see me excited, but he has this moment where he does not want this to be true. And he's almost begging me to take it back. So he really did hog the air that night. And then after it was George Bush, he backed off.
Well, how about the evening news? Was it hard to get a piece on the evening news? I mean, in your book, Lesley, you called it a Turkish bazaar.
Well, you did have to sell. You'd have a story, but every other correspondent around the world had a story. And in those days, I mean, there were 25 or something like that reporters just in Washington. Today, we have so shrunk down, it's nothing like this. But in those days, you would be competing with 30, 40 other people who were all screaming into Sandy Sokolow, we've got the best story in the world. And Sandy and Walter would probably put their heads together and have to pick, how many stories? 8 at the most? 5 or 6 stories out of 30 people all saying, no, I've got the biggest story in the world. Luckily, I was covering the White House, and I got picked a lot because the president...
And what, you had like 22 minutes or something? I mean, the
whole
show had 22 minutes.
was probably 22 minutes, and a story, the average story was 90 seconds.
Yeah.
And if you could make it shorter, they loved you.
I found that reporting from overseas, it was pretty, we didn't get into this bazaar, I should call it, because you couldn't. The communications were generally, wherever you were so terrible. You couldn't go and plead your case. But I thought we got, I mean, in those Cronkite years where there was really genuine interest in foreign policy and foreign stories, it was not a big deal. It was pretty easy to get on the air.
But this was also pre-satellite, wasn't it?
It was pre-satellite and then very early days of satellite.
Yeah.
I mean, the first satellite, the inauguration of I think it was called Telstar, Sandy, was it? This was such a big deal, and I was in London, and each of the networks were given something like 50 or 60 seconds to do their piece, their magical piece from all the way from London. But because the satellite was only overhead for like 3 minutes, and then you lost it. So we were lining up. You know, it was like a line for the men's room or something. I got to go now. And it was just, I mean, it was television news at its most absurd, because there was nothing to report from London that morning, except that there was this thing going over, which no one could see, by the way.
You were reporting about how you were reporting.
We were saying, gee whiz, I'm really in London. Honest to God, I am really in London. And it's live.
Did you want to add to that?
Well, I wanted to say that when you were in London, and for, I would say up until George, the first Bush's presidency, no, when did we switch? We switched earlier, when Jimmy Carter was president. We worked in film. Film had to be developed. So you had the actual time to think. And you had to wait for the film to be developed. You had hours to make phone calls. You could actually call people and get opposing views on the phone. You could call an analyst and get some depth. Then video came in, and that time shrank because the deadline wouldn't be so early. And now it's instant. They don't think at all. It happens, and they're on the air. They do. It's true. The president speaks, and 2 seconds later, the reporter's right there, and he's telling you. Or a story happens, and before you can make a single phone call, you're called upon.
Lesley makes, I think it's an excellent point. Before everything being live and cutting correspondence in on to covering stories as they're covering. There is no thinking time. And I think it really does a disservice to the audience. I mean, you might have been in a combat mission of some kind in Vietnam, but then you had to go to the airport and ship that film back. But you had time to sit and write a thoughtful piece. It could have mean something. It wasn't just shoot 'em up. And people can't do that anymore. And I think it shows pretty much.
Literally think while they're talking now, right?
Yeah, well, it's
if they can.
which is so much of particularly on those all news stations, is just blather. It's not no substance to it. It's just they do it brilliantly, by the way.
Brilliant blather.
Well,
but it's just blather.
I could ask you a million other questions. We're not too far away from the end of the time here, but I want to ask you if you think that there is a Cronkite legacy in journalism or not.
You go first, and then I'll go.
There is a Cronkite legacy. I think the legacy diminishes with each year, quite honestly. Part of it is the whole nature of broadcast news has changed so much. Partly what I was talking about, this 24-hour, never-ending cycle of news, or what passes for news. And I don't think the only place you can really, on a daily news broadcast, get any kind of what I regard as thoughtful journalism is on the NewsHour. That's pretty much it.
The PBS NewsHour.
And I don't follow CBS News or NBC News or ABC News. It's just the dictate of the time. How long are the pieces? I mean, we used to get 2.5 and 3 minute pieces on the air. You know, hardly a documentary, but by this television standard, a 22-minute or 28-minute at one point broadcast. That was a lot of time. And what is it now, Lesley? 40 seconds?
I don't know, it's less for sure,
45
as
seconds.
is our show less. I was going to attack it differently, and not in terms of journalism, because I think Walter really did. We know he did. He affected American history. And I was trying to get it in the right order. When Walter came out publicly against the Vietnam War, and as Lyndon Johnson said, when you lose Cronkite, you know, you've lost the country. He affected public opinion on Vietnam and changed the course of the war. He affected, I believe, the space program, because Walter was so enthusiastic about space. He got the country behind the space program and allowed Congress to fund it. He affected Watergate. The stories I told you about were extremely influential and elevated the story in the public's mind. Time and again, because Walter Cronkite was so trusted, the public listened to him more than they listened to the politicians. And so he was able to affect the course of history. And I would say his legacy is strongest in that sense. What Morley's talking about is the deterioration of journalism, which is a wholly different thing. And when Walter left the stage, he left us with wonderful standards and a wonderful model, but things are different, and he hasn't been on the stage for a long time now.
And a rich history, and it's you know, the nature of reporting the news has been dictated by technology now, and some of it's wonderful, but the net effect may not be so wonderful.
But tell them how we still have those standards at 60 Minutes,
Well,
Morley.
yeah.
Well, I was going to ask you about. I was going to ask you about 60 Minutes, so I'm glad.
and if to a certain extent, and I'm not. I don't think we can pin everything on Walter in terms of the positive side of broadcast news. At 60 Minutes, we are very old-fashioned CBS News. The rules we work by, very tight control, and I think we're fair, and however objective you can be in reporting, I think we are. And so we still operate by those standards, which were Walter's standards, but there's the standards of many others, including Moreau and the Moreau boys.
Well, those standards are alive and well at 60 Minutes, which is why we both still love working there.
But I think that what I hear you saying, Lesley, is that Walter Cronkite has a historical legacy.
Right.
That's important to American history.
And you would know more than I, because you sat and listened to him and walked him through what I left out. I was that was off the top of my head. I'm sure there were other enormously important, Middle East.
Right, the diplomacy.
Right.
Egypt and Israel.
Exactly. So, I mean, he
a real legacy there historically.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
he's an American giant.
Absolutely. Well, we've got a couple of questions from the audience. I believe Mr. Updegrove is standing by. Over to you, Mark.
Well, this first question is mine, and Lesley, it goes back to what you were talking about. Walter Cronkite had such influence and such gravitas. I'm wondering, in this day and age, is there anyone who could be like Walter Cronkite, or is media so fragmented that it would be impossible?
I do think it's impossible. If you look at how many people watched Walter every night when Morley joined, and continuing through the 70s, probably into the 80s, there were really only 3 places to watch national news, and everybody in the country watched one of the 3 network news shows. So, and Walter had the highest ratings for years and years and years. And that gave him that kind of a platform. And even presidents back then, if the president wanted to give a speech, there was nothing else for anybody to watch in the country but the president if you turned your television on or radio on. Everybody carried it and so forth. Now with cable, each little news outlet has an audience that's thinner and smaller every year. And so it's so fragmented. People say that President Obama is out there too much. Well, he's trying to make sure everybody hears him, because he knows that no single large group is watching one outlet. So I worry about democracy. I worry about how our leaders are going to talk to us. I think, broadcasting is over. We are in narrowcasting and narrower casting. And I think it hurts the system.
Also, the definition of news or journalism has so broadened. And probably to a good number of people, the most arresting journalist on the air is a creep like Bill O'Reilly.
And what is really stunning is if you look at how small his audience is compared to what Walter's was. Yep. I mean, it is a slight fraction.
I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. Don alluded to the golden age of news journalism some years back. Is there any, given what you've just talked about, is there any reason to hope that we might get to a stage where we're talking in future years about a golden age of journalism that happens in the future?
Well, everybody is searching for what they call the model on the internet. It's very, very difficult. I'm the co-owner of a website I'll give myself a plug. It's called wowowow.com. And it stands for Women on the Web. All women in the room should check it out. It's terrific. But how journalists make money on the web is a problem. People aren't willing to pay for content on the web. And if you don't pay, you're not going to get the smartest kids in the class going into journalism. So all journalism schools around the country, all journalism reporters, departments, everybody's trying to figure out where we go from here, how we solve this problem. I despair, to be honest with you. I really despair. And yet I do speak at journalism schools, and there are awfully bright people there, but I worry about where they're going to be putting their brains, how they're going to go out and cover our government, make sure we don't become a corrupt system. Where are they going to put their information so that everybody reads it? I can't see the way out.
One of the problems, and I think journalism is in the process of sorting itself out, and of course it's fractured into these tiny slivers, as you say, and the web doesn't pay any money. But we were talking about this at lunch, and the fact is that the people who are really determined to be journalists will continue to be journalists. They will find those places on the web, and you know, it may be doing it for free or virtually for free. But look, it's only in these last few years that journalists got paid real money anyway. Mostly we were, you know, at the lowest end of the social and financial scale. So.
Well, we're on a university campus.
We've just been very lucky.
We're on a university campus, obviously, and we had lunch today with Glenn Frankel, who is our new director of the School of Journalism, and that's what who Morley was referring to. And Glenn told us today that journalism's still a hot ticket for students, and even though they don't know where they're going to go or how they're going to get paid.
I meet the brightest kids still attracted to the profession. They're right. It's the most wonderful profession. If you have any ounce of idealism, this is a wonderful place to channel it, really. But I do worry. I worry about the fragmentation being sliced so thin that you will find that you don't have an impact, and that becomes a problem.
You have two more questions. 60 Minutes is a tried and true formula, it seems, but I'm wondering, this goes back to what you were talking about earlier, Morley, if this age of instant information, the expectations of your audience has changed 60 Minutes in any way.
No, it hasn't. I don't think it has at all. And the fact is that, look, we used to run 17-minute pieces, unheard of. Now they're down to 11. That's because there are so many damn commercials on the broadcast. 11 and 12. But, you know, it's the damn commercials that pay the freight that keep us at least being able to do, I think, a pretty thorough job on the stories we choose. So, but we are really the odd broadcast out in terms of news. We're doing it the most old-fashioned way that you can imagine. And the truth of it is, there is no fashion. Either it's interesting or it's not interesting. And I think we maintain a certain level of professionalism, of seriousness, of humor, of whatever. And 60 Minutes from its birth was always about the right mix of stories. And people often ask me, well, how do you account for the success of the broadcast? And really, how the hell do I know? But I think that that no matter what your interests are, you're going to find one thing on that broadcast that you glad you saw. And I think that's why the audiences keep coming back for more. That they know, they may not give a damn about Iraq or Afghanistan or football, but there's some story in the middle there that it really turns them on. And that's what I think keeps,
You know what
dare I say, generation after generation watching.
what I find is people say, you know, I saw that you were 60 Minutes, not you or me, but 60 Minutes was going to do a story on football or whatever. And I wasn't interested, and then I watched it, and you took me into an interesting angle on it. And what I'm amazed by is that our audience is going back up again. We had a dip because we lost football, and to have a sports lead-in is important for us.
These
in
are the
fall.
great-grandchildren of our first viewers.
Well, didn't
Or put a different way, as somebody said to me, the people who watch 60 Minutes are old people and their parents. Fetal position.
Wasn't it Don Hewitt who when he was asked about the success of 60 Minutes, he said, "Tell me a story."
Yep.
Wasn't that what?
That was Don's.
And that was one of the
secret.
keys to what you do is, you know, tell a good story.
Well, that's the aim.
Yeah.
Yeah, the last question. Every fisherman has a story of the one that got away. Do either of you have stories that eluded you, that you never quite got, but you wish you had?
Yeah, there's one story that I worked on, tried to. I don't know if the name Kim Philby means anything to you.
Yeah,
Probably, you know, the spy of the century who was, you know, he was a very top level, almost the top level of British foreign intelligence, and had been a Soviet spy since before the Second World War. And I got to know his son, who was a photographer, and we got some messages to Philby once he defected to Russia. And I just tried and tried and tried. And,
To get an interview with him?
yeah, and then he up and died.
Well, that'll put a crimp in that.
That'll kill a good story.
Well, I'm going to tell you a story, but first, before I do, there's a couple in the audience. Mark, Carla, are you here? Raise your hand. They're not here. Oh, okay. All right. That wasn't the story I was going to tell. My story's a little different from the story that got away. People often ask, you know, what happens if you go out on a story? Do you go out with a purpose? And often we do. We often go out knowing our story ahead of time. And it's different from covering the White House, the daily journalism, because you never know what you're going to confront. You just follow the action. At 60 Minutes, we work on our stories. We do our investigations before we get out there. I wanted very much to do a story that proved how much money mattered to education, to the classroom, and that if inner city schools got as much money as the rich suburbs around them, then the kids in the inner cities would do better. And we searched and searched for a case like that, where you would see the inner city school in the nearby suburb and basically prove that it was all about money. So we finally, it took me years to find the story, but we found it in Kansas City. And the reason it was such a good laboratory to look at this was because they were under a federal court order to spend as much money in the city as they were spending in the suburbs, because it was almost like a civil rights issue that the kids in the inner city were being deprived. So they were the state was under the court order. So the state poured millions, multi-millions of dollars, like $25 million, and this was back in the early 90s, to bring the inner city schools up to par. And they did everything you've ever heard of. They got rid of the tired old teachers. They had teachers' aides. They had reduced the classrooms. They built new buildings. They had computers all over the place. They did absolutely every single reform you could think would help, because they had money they didn't even know how to spend. And the test scores went down. So I set out to do a story to say money was going to make the difference. And I had to go on the air and say it didn't. And what I learned, what I personally learned, was that it's the parents. So then I went and did another story about the parents. So sometimes, and more often than you'd think, you set out to do a story, you know what you want to do, and the story takes you in the opposite direction.
Thank you. Before I thank our guests, I want to rectify an oversight earlier this evening. I neglected to mention one special guest, and he's been mentioned from the stage several times, and that is Sandy Sokolow, who was Walter Cronkite's producer for many